Hi.
Hello again. In the prior segment, we were at the rock mass, or rock in most Bibles, the statement of verse 18, Matthew 16, after Christ has elicited a confession from Peter on behalf of the disciples. In response to the question, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter has responded, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Barjonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." We made the point that this is not in the Gospel of Mark, nor in the Gospel of Luke, in the parallel passage. More about that in a minute. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Now, of course, those who have some familiarity with the Roman Catholic teaching will know that this is the exclusive claim of the Roman Church, that the Pope, in the person of the new Peter, or the descendant of Peter, has those keys, and they're unique to the Catholic hierarchy. But in Matthew 18, of course, the point is made in Protestant circles that, well, the keys of the kingdom are given to the other disciples as well, so that whatever authority they represent is not unique to Peter and his putative descendants. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then this somewhat mysterious finale to the segment, which is, then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. Why not? If it's the truth about Jesus, and it's revealed by God the Father, why not tell it? Well, more about that as we read through the rest of chapter 16.
So starting at verse 21. From that time forward, Jesus commenced showing his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the older men and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised up. At this, Peter took him aside and commenced rebuking him, saying, "Be kind to yourself, Lord. You will not have this destiny at all." But turning his back, he said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, because you think not God's thoughts, but those of men." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone wants to come after me, let him disown himself, and pick up his torture stake, and continually follow me. For whoever wants to save his soul will lose it, but whoever loses his soul for my sake will find it. For what benefit will it be to a man if he gains the whole world, but forfeits his soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is destined to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will recompense each one according to his behavior. Truly I say to you that there are some of those standing here that will not taste death at all until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom."
Oh, well, that's the harshest reproof I know of that Christ ever issued to anyone.
Even the Pharisees didn't get that.
Even his religious enemies, those who ultimately killed him, did not get this kind of reproof. "Get behind me, Satan." So what has Peter done to deserve this reproof? Well, he's just made the right confession as to who Jesus is, the Christ, the Son of the living God. What is it that's causing Peter to think that that will not mean what Christ clearly says it will mean, that he must go up to Jerusalem and suffer many things, be killed, and on the third day be raised? Well, Peter has got a version of confirmation bias, which is he's not even reading his Old Testament properly without the glasses that he wants to put on to read it or to hear it.
So his Jewish glasses, or his rabbi glasses, that would have focused more on the aspects of the Messiah's glorious kingdom and establishment, and none of the suffering part.
Yeah, we already know that the disciples have been fighting and will go on fighting about who's going to sit at Christ's right hand in the kingdom.
Yeah.
They have the traditional Jewish view of what this kingdom is. It's centered in Jerusalem, and it's Jewish, and it's really about what's in it for us. It's the ultimate fulfillment of the promises made to Abraham.
Yeah, yeah. So as Jehovah's Witnesses, we should be able to relate to that, because our emphasis is, or our thinking, when I was a witness, was Paradise Earth, and being on Paradise Earth, and it being established, and me being able to live at peace with people and animals, and living at the cottage all the time.
And it won't be postponed past your lifetime. It will be in your lifetime, and soon.
Yeah.
So we have a lot in common with the
Yeah.
Jewish understanding of that day, which is, by the way, tied to another aberration of today, which is the prosperity gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And some of you will have seen preachers like Benny Hinn and Kenneth Copeland on television, and a lot of these generally Pentecostal preachers will preach this prosperity gospel, which is basically you can have your pie
Or your cake.
and your cake, and you can have it then and you can have it now because you're the king's kids. You can have it all.
Yeah.
And that was the scandal, or the rock mass, or the stumbling stone over which the Jews tripped. Paul makes that point. He actually uses the same Greek word. It would be good to put in a plug-in for a certain kind of Bible tool here. This is the NASB NIV interlinear Greek parallel New Testament in Greek and English, edited by Alfred Marshall. If you check out the word that's used here for stumbling block or hindrance in the ESV, that word is actually, well, it's not bad what the Watchtower does with it. What do they translate skandalon as in that verse?
You mean you are a stumbling
block
to me,
or a stumbling stone over which I can trip. So if you look in 1 Corinthians 2 here, you will notice that 1 Corinthians 2 has the very same Greek word. When Paul says of the Jews that they stumbled over Christ, that the cross is a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks, he's using that very same Greek word skandalon, which means literally rock. So rock or stumbling stone. So when you think of it that way, you realize that in Matthew at least, this is another extension of that Greek idea, the pun as it were, the Petros Petron, now skandalon is attached to that. And Matthew is the only one who does this. If you look at the parallels in the other two synoptic gospels, and here's another plug for tools. The synoptic gospels are often studied together, and if you have a harmony like this famous one, this is perhaps the most famous one in English, A.T. Robertson's Harmony of the Gospels, where you can get the Gospels in parallel columns, usually the three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke. John is usually different in wording, so it gets a page of its own. But if you look side by side at the three passages, which are Mark, Matthew, and Luke, you realize that this stuff about the rock and the stumbling stone is not in the other two. There's hundreds of books about the synoptic issue. The controversy is not about whether the synoptics see things the same way. They generally do. That's why the word synoptic is used of them, because they generally look at the Christ story from the same viewpoint.
So tell them about this one.
There's lots of books about this. Most of them take the position that Mark is the first of the three Gospels, the three synoptics. Some disagree, but they're in the distinct minority. Mark the first, usually Luke is thought to be the second, and Matthew the third. But it's not important, the order. What is important to note is that there's a lot of not only similarity in the way they approach the story of Jesus, but even the wording is identical in many cases.
It's probably noteworthy what is missing and what is there, what is the same.
Yeah.
What they have in common.
And among New Testament scholars and theologians, this is one of the most discussed subjects.
Right after saying the thing about stumbling block, he says, you think not God's thoughts, but those of men. And I would say that's also something that as Jehovah's Witnesses we had in common with Peter. That's probably why we all like Peter. He's so much like us. but the thoughts of men. We reason things out, and the rabbis did the same thing. It seemed reasonable to them. It always seems reasonable that it come in your time. That's what we all want, is things to be rectified and justice to be met during our lifetime. So he's no different than we as witnesses, and as the rabbis would have been wanting it to happen.
And are.
Yeah, wanting it to happen. And so for the ones that reject Christ, that's part of the reason, is they look at all the texts, they see what they want to see.
The glory text.
Yeah, and it hasn't happened, and then they think, well, he couldn't have been the Christ because things didn't turn out the way you humanly wanted it to turn out.
So if you look at the many debates between rabbis and Christians on YouTube, you'll find this is the pattern of their explanation as to why Jews have never accepted the Christ is because he didn't fulfill the prophecies about the deliverance of the Jews from Gentile oppression.
Yeah.
So they're still carrying on in modern Judaism the same prejudice that you see in Peter here. You can't die because that can't happen to Messiah.
Yeah. And it's the same reason that some Christians will reject the idea of Israel still being in God's plan, because they look at the people now in disbelief, in exile from God, having been spread around countries, and they think, well, that's proof that they can't be there.
The chosen people.
They haven't come to faith. So, but that's human reasoning, and it's also a preoccupation with your own time, because it's not happening now in my lifetime during what I see happening. Then it can't be true.
In the connection between the prosperity gospel as preached by many of the TV evangelists and the Watchtower version of the prosperity gospel, it is marked only that although the incentive is still the same, if you are faithful now, you will gain that, which is, in the Watchtower's case, dead ahead. In the prosperity case, it's now. You will have very shortly if you invest your money in, let's say us, the TV evangelists. If you seed money in us, you will get your reward shortly. The Watchtower's version is you sacrifice right around the corner, and right around the corner your reward comes.
Is coming. Yeah.
But how is that denying yourself? I mean, then it's about you, just as it was for Peter back then.
The focus is on yourself and on what you're going to get, rather than on the King, Christ,
and sacrifice
and his glory, and following him in example even.
It's not like this is a new idea for Peter and the disciples, though. It's in continuity with their own historical Old Testament. That is from Abraham, who, after all, was in tents wandering around the Promised Land, even though he'd been promised that he and his descendants would inherit it. And then Moses, who guides them toward the Promised Land, but never actually enters it.
They don't actually see the promise.
He also lives in tents for that period of time till he dies. That lesson is in the Old Testament itself. And then, of course, the ones who did inherit the land didn't have it for a long time. They were out of it within 400 or 500 years. So then the promises of gain from this are all postponed until the eschaton of the kingdom future, which is mentioned here.
Yeah, in verse 27. Yeah.
The Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of the Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he's done. So there's that gospel aspect of future kingdom and a day of judgment again. And there are rewards for faithful behavior, but they probably aren't now and in your lifetime.
Or not, at least not the kind of things you're wanting.
Not the external things that Peter and the disciples would be thinking about as Jews of Old Testament times. Under the Old Covenant, the rewards were in this life, not in any future life or even in a resurrection. So Christ, surprise, surprise, says you also have to pick up your cross. It's not only I who will have to sacrifice myself on God's altar. You too will have to take up your cross daily.
So
deny yourself.
Yeah, you can see that, he's saying those who want to save their soul will lose it. Those who will lose their soul will save it. So it is contrary to human thinking. It is upside down. It's counterculture type of living. So what God or what Christ asked of us is that we be self-sacrificing, self-denying.
And any gospel, so-called, that essentially stresses kingdom benefits now, carnal benefits now or immediate future, is by this definition a satanic delusion. If it's about us and us benefiting in this life, whether it be right now or immediately in the future, it's a satanic delusion. We've got to get our minds around that Christ rebukes this idea more strongly than any other idea that was thrust at his way, because after all, Peter should have known better after 3 years of being taught by Christ personally and being raised in the Old Testament. Our problem, like Peter's, is, like you said before, we like to think it's going to come in our day.
Yeah, and they had been in expectation of him. And in some ways they have more excuse because they had Christ right there before them. They recognized who he was. He was the Messiah. You know, you'd get pretty excited, I think, and you'd think, oh, it's going to happen now. You can partly understand where that excitement would come from.
Of course. But life is a pilgrimage. Abraham was taught that. And if you read Hebrews 11, the Hall of Fame of Faith, you realize that that's the continual message, that all of these ones suffered for their faith. And this is not just a New Testament teaching, it's also from the Old Testament where Hebrews gets its lessons from. So it's not about us, and it's certainly not about now. This pilgrimage, it's good enough for Christ, it's good enough for us. That is, it says of him that he tabernacled among us. And that very word means tented among us. So Christ himself had to wait the day when he was exalted to the position of king in the kingdom, and we too are being trained to be kings and priests, and the only way apparently is the way of Christ, which was the way of suffering. He learned obedience, it says of him in Hebrews, from the things he suffered.
So be preoccupied, eyes on him, Christ, rather than yourself.
Again Hebrews, right?
Yeah.
Look at Christ and him crucified. As Paul said, his gospel was a stumbling block to the Greeks, rather a stumbling block to the Jews, and foolishness to the Greeks. So in the next segment, we're going to take up some of the marks of the true fellowship in the Gospel of Matthew.